He's a sawing and jawing and doing his thing.
Hey Woodworkers, I'm your buddy Dave and welcome back to the Saws and Jaws Workshop. Nice to have you back with us. This is episode 7 called Dead Saw Walking. And just like the poor convict in that movie, there was a time after I bought my first table saw, I wanted to walk that baby to its own death row. Because I did not do enough research on what I wanted or what was available. So naturally, when I got it back to my shop, the performance was terrible. And then the features and accessories of the table saw turned out to be substandard. Who knew? So, if you're a new woodworker and you find yourself in this position, you've already gone out and maybe pulled the pin on a purchase, you're not happy, well, take heart. I'm going to show you how, with the purchase of a couple of aftermarket pieces for your table saw, a couple of key things, a couple of jigs we're going to build to help tune the table saw a little bit better, and finally, don't forget our Getting Jiggy series of 5 table saw jigs. Combined, that's going to rock up the performance of your table saw. So, if you think you've gone out and bought a lemon, just remember, what do we do with lemons? Life throws us lemons. What do we make? When you get lemons, you make beer, of course. And you're going to want to hold on to this beer because after this episode, you're going to celebrate all the new knowledge you're going to get about how to fix up that table saw purchase you're not too happy with. So, sound good? Well, let's get started. Cheers. Okay, woodworkers, we're back at the table saw. You've got a nice view at the rear of the table saw. So we're going to look at how to mitigate the mistakes of a bad purchase. So the situation is, I went out without a lot of research and I pretty much bought the first table saw I looked at. I knew I wanted a table saw. I knew I probably couldn't afford a big cabinet saw, so I had contractor saw in the back of my head. So again, at a big box store, I went out and bought the first table saw that I saw one afternoon after I'd made the decision to buy one. So I do not recommend that approach. With the magic interweb that we have today, the magic web, you have tons of research options available to you. So you shouldn't make that mistake. So we'll just leave it at that. Make sure you do a lot of research on the saw's features, some of the accessories, and you won't get into a jam. But if you are in a jam, you've gone out and you've bought something you're not too happy with, let's look at what I did and how I got out of my jam and the things I did to mitigate my mistake. So we're going to start at the back of the table saw. You're going to see that it is, in fact, a contractor saw. The back is wide open, as most contractor saws are. And you've got the motor hanging out here in the back. So, taking a look at the back end of this guy, first thing that you'll notice that I changed was this belt. So I took the original belt that came with the table saw and I replaced it with what's called a link belt. And the reason I did that was the original belts can sometimes, if you're not using the saw for a long period of time, the belt itself will form into the last shape that it is sitting in, and it'll have a flat spot as the saw is turning. So you don't want to be in that situation. The link belt is great because it doesn't do that. It's always ready to go, always flexible. So I love the link belt. First little gizmo that I put on. Second thing is, motor, as we said, hangs off the back. The motor is, in this case, quite surprisingly for an inexpensive table saw, this is a 2 horsepower electric motor. And I can even wire it for 220 if I want to. So that was a bonus that I really didn't research or expect, but sometimes life works out. So 2 horsepower motor, very cool. You'll notice, again, the back of the contractor saw is always wide open. So that's going to cause your shop to fill with dust if you don't do something about it. So I've done a couple of things. First thing I did was to build a little jig or fixture, whatever you want to call it, that slides up to cover this opening, leaving just the slots for the motor mounts and the belt for the blade. And what I did was I've attached it with, hope you can see that, rare earth magnets. So let's slide that guy into place. And that goes something like, just like that. So now I've sealed out probably 95% of the sawdust that's going to blow out of the back. And also, I don't know if you can see it in the shot, I've got a 4-inch diameter hose connected, and I have a 1 horsepower dust collector. So I will hook that up if I'm doing a lot of cutting. If I'm not doing a lot of cutting, this thing really just knocks most of the sawdust down. And in these little gaps here, you can certainly put a piece of duct tape over it and reduce the dust even further. So that's the back of the saw. First item I changed out was the belt. Probably about a $15, $16 investment at the time. So now let's move to the top of the table saw. Okay, so we're back, and we now have a shot at the top of the table saw. And what you're seeing in this shot is pretty much how the saw came equipped. So you've heard me say before, one of the first things I did was to get rid of this splitter and anti-kickback assembly, because the splitter combined with this fairly cheap blade guard was actually getting in the way. It was actually hanging up the cuts as I was moving them through, especially on a rip cut. So not a good situation. So we're going to set this stuff aside because I've replaced it. Second thing you'll notice is my table saw came with a fairly cheapo miter gauge. The head part of it, the part that's supposed to have the most accuracy, is just a stamped aluminum. I think that's a stamped aluminum piece, and not very accurate. And we can see it rattles quite a bit. It's not in the slot very tight. Now there's a few things you can do to mitigate that, but again, it's a pretty cheap piece of kit, so we're going to toss that out. Now I think Barry can fly in a picture of the table saw, and we'll start to put little X's through all the gear that we're going to replace. So I said there was going to be a few aftermarket purchases. So this was definitely one of them. So let's set this aside. See what we replaced it with. So we replaced it with an Incra miter gauge. I think Incra makes 3 different levels. This is the basic entry level. I felt it was a good match for what I had paid for the table saw. I think this was about 90 bucks. So we're going to put that guy in there right there. And the first thing we notice, no rattle. It's fantastic. It slides so smoothly in these miter slots. And it really amps up the accuracy on your cross cuts. So, bing, that's the first one. We'll cross off the old miter gauge. And what we've done from an aftermarket perspective, again, that's about a $90 purchase. Next thing that I didn't realize was so horrible when I bought it was the throat plate. So most inexpensive saws come with a real cheap, again, stamped aluminum throat plate. And the problem with the throat plate is, number one, it doesn't fit very well in the opening. And number two, I think you can see that, hopefully, it's not flat across its top. So that is going to cause some inaccuracies, maybe cause some splintering as you cut. So how did we fix this? Very simply. We used this as a template to make a zero clearance insert. So this is a piece of 1/4 inch hardboard. We essentially taped it to the original throat plate, and we were able to cut it out and trim it to size with a router so that it sits in there just like that. Now suddenly I've got a great cross-cutting solution, and I've got zero clearance here to stop tear out on my workpiece. Now we save this for later if we're going to make another throat plate. So not too bad so far. And you'll notice we got rid of the safety gear. And I'll just point out on this throat plate we have a little splitter. So I've just used a 3/32 inch drill bit. I've put it right in line with the saw kerf, and that will prevent a workpiece from closing around the blade and kicking back at me. So that works really well. So again, we'll set that back in there. And again, we took the set screws out of the original throat plate and we put them in here, and then we can raise or lower this so that we can get it absolutely level with the tabletop. Okay, so moving right along. The next thing that we did, one of the most critical pieces of aftermarket kit that you're going to want to look at is the rip fence. So as delivered, this fairly inexpensive table saw had a interesting fence system, I guess it came with it. So the rip fence fits in there kind of like that, slides back and forth. Don't know if you can see that. It was an interesting conundrum I found myself in. I could never get this rip fence to clamp down. You see it's got a clamp here at the back. I could never get it to clamp down so that it was parallel. No matter how much I adjusted this thing, it would not stay parallel. That's a problem. So this thing had to go. It took me a number of years to come to that conclusion. I tried everything. I put an auxiliary fence on here and I don't know, all kinds of different strategies. But finally I decided, you know what, I'm going to look for an aftermarket rip fence. So, Barry, let's X this guy off. This was the other thing that we're going to get rid of. Let's set that right over here. Now, one of the problems I had was when I rushed out and made my purchase, I didn't do a lot of research on the different types of contractor saws, because guess what? There's different sizes. Duh. And what I ended up with, I'm just going to measure this thing. I ended up with a table saw that only is 23 inches deep. Now a regular contractor saw is going to be probably at least 27 inches. So that's going to cause a bit of a problem for me when I try to get a rip fence. Because most rip fences, most aftermarket rip fences, are built for a much larger saw deck. So I would have had, if I had gone with a standard, I think Vega makes an aftermarket rip fence. There's various Beisermeer knockoffs. But I would have had, gosh, a whole ton of extra room hanging off the end of my saw, and it probably wouldn't have been a very good fit or clamp down very well. So I finally did a bit of research, and I ended up working with a company called Workshop Supply in Embro, Ontario. So I want to give them a shout out, especially to Steve Siddell. Steve helped me figure out the best aftermarket table saw for this depth of saw table, and they happen to have a kit called a red line fence. So I ended up purchasing that from Workshop Supply. Again, I got a lot of help from you folks, and I want to give you a thumbs up and a shout out. So let's add the red line fence, and here we go. So I'll put this guy on. So suddenly, we've solved a couple of major problems. We've got a really good cross-cut solution now, and we've got a really good rip fence that tightens down absolutely parallel and zero flex. This thing is amazing. So I've been very happy with that, and again, opens up a bunch of new horizons for us on the table saw. So let's slide this out of the way. And for me, this was a almost finished solution. The only problem left for me was I was still getting a bit of burning and scoring on my rip cuts, and having a little bit of trouble getting things squared up. Then I realized that I probably did not have the saw blade exactly parallel to the miter slots. That's a problem, folks. So on an inexpensive table saw, if you bring one home, I'm just going to crank the blade up here. If you bring one home, you're probably going to have that problem. So what you have to do is you have to really get serious about aligning the blade parallel with this slot. And that's can be a bit tricky. This contractor saw, and pretty much all of them, have 4 bolts that you loosen. Sounds easy, doesn't it? And then you basically adjust parallel to your blade. And don't panic, we are unplugged. So if you don't spend time getting that exactly parallel, and I was able to get mine to within 1/100th of an inch. that is like nirvana in the setup world. So I'm quite happy now with the way that my saw is set up. I'm getting exactly the cuts that I want, and I've got, even though I've got a tiny little table saw, this was the cool green color that I went out and bought, even though I have that, I'm quite happy with it. Again, with the addition of the red line fence, the guide that the fence runs in, should mention that it's actually 1/8 of an inch aluminum channel, absolutely rock solid. The stuff that came with the saw was about 1/16 of an inch, so nowhere near as solid. So that is how I have mitigated my table saw problem. And yeah, it cost me a few bucks. I've still got a slightly undersized saw, but with a 2 horsepower motor, I can overcome most problems. And to me, that was the biggest bonus. The best feature of this saw as it came from the big box store was the 2 horsepower motor. Its worst feature was actually everything else. So pretty much replaced the key bits there. Let's review the miter gauge slot and then the rip fence. And then absolutely making sure that I'm parallel to the blade, that the blade is parallel to the miter slot. So that's key. If you get that, you're going to have happy cutting. Hey woodworkers, we're back to wrap up episode 7, dead saw walking. We saw how I was able to walk my table saw mistake back from death row. We got a last minute call from the governor for a reprieve. That's because we were able to purchase some really nice aftermarket accessories for the table saw. Very quickly, starting from the back, we replaced the link belt, or we replaced the original drive belt with a link belt. We then replaced the miter gauge, the Radley miter gauge, with a nice Incra miter gauge. We updated the throat plate with a homemade zero clearance throat plate. We'll throw one of those together in a future episode. But the key feature, the key accessory that we purchased was the red line rip fence, and that allowed us to absolutely move the rip fence back and forth and lock it down parallel to the miter slots. Oh, and I don't know if you caught the mistake I made when I was talking about getting the blade parallel to the miter slots. I said we had reached nirvana by getting it front to back within 1/100th of an inch. Duh, no, made a mistake. We actually got that to within 1/1000th of an inch. So Barry's going to fly in a couple of pictures. We'll see the measurement at the front of the blade. You measure a tooth at the front, and then you measure the same tooth at the back, and you can see the needle on that dial gauge barely moves. Really happy with that adjustment, and that's key. You need to get that one done, or your table saw is never going to cut right. Anyway, I want to tell you about the next episode. Really excited about that. We're going to be introducing a brand new major power tool to the Saws and Jaws workshop. We're going to have an unboxing event. We're going to put it together and we're going to turn that bad boy on. Anyway, not going to tell you what that is. You're going to have to tune into the episode. But here's a hint. Maybe you want to break out your Paul McCartney and Wings album and play the song Band on the Run. Anyway, you might also want to check out our Instagram account. There's some hints there. And that's all I'm going to say. We'll hope to see you here. So, until we do see you here again at the Saws and Jaws workshop, just want to say, keep on making some sawdust.